Let me give you an example. Malheur Lake, located on the Malheur National Wildlife Refuge, was once a pristine, freshwater, hemi-marsh environment, meaning that there was an abundance of emergent and submergent vegetation. However, currently, Malheur Lake is a highly turbid environment, or mucky environment. And as a PhD student, I was asked to construct a model to better understand the drivers of turbidity in Malheur Lake, as well as try and identify some management alternatives that could be utilized to potentially shift Malheur Lake from the highly turbid environment back to that clear, pristine environment. So to do this, we modeled the entire system, and we focused first on carp. And the carp gave us fairly straightforward answers in the modeling process. Carp are problematic. They affect the ecosystem because of their mode of feeding. They use a suction feeding technique which physically uproots the aquatic vegetation while simultaneously suspending the sediment in the water column. So with that being said, we wanted to better understand how we can affect the carp population. And it turns out via the modeling that we can affect the carp population if we focus on multiple life stages. Just focusing on the adult life stage won't get us to where we want to be to potentially promote the recovery of Malheur Lake. So we need to focus on multiple life stages, such as the adult, juvenile, and even the embryo stages by affecting recruitment. So those model responses were fairly intuitive, but we started to add more elements of the system in which we started to kind of get some counterintuitive responses. For instance, we started to add in hydrologic variability, or the precipitation that's happening here in Harney Basin. And we started to notice that as the lake grows and shrinks, the carp population goes through boom and bust population cycles. So some years there may be a lot of carp throughout Malheur Lake, and they might be doing a lot of damage. But other years, due to the hydrologic variability and the density-dependent interactions within the carp population, you might actually have some very low carp biomasses in Malheur Lake. However, we didn't see responses via on-the-ground research and simulated research in the aquatic ecosystem. We didn't see that move back to the clear state. We did see a little bit of submergent vegetation come back, but we didn't see that full-on aquatic restoration. And we started to wonder why that was. So for the last aspect of the systems model, we started to model wind resuspension in Malheur Lake. And through this modeling, we determined that in the absence of carp, either via our reductions, via commercial harvest or something like that, or just the density-dependent interactions that affect the carp population, the turbid state is maintained via the wind resuspension that's happening in Malheur Lake. And it has to do with the unique nature of Malheur Lake, the shallow nature and the long wind fetches of Malheur Lake. So even when the carp population goes down, we don't see that the aquatic restoration immediately because of this maintenance of the turbid state via the wind resuspension. So with all that being said, these were counterintuitive responses, not really things that we were thinking about before we started modeling. So that's an example of how kind of the simulation doesn't really match up with what we were seeing out in the real world, or what we were thinking about in the real world. And to further that point, in the simulations, we started to look into some kind of management alternatives. And one of those management alternatives was wind reduction barriers. So man-made constructed wind reduction barriers. And these wind reduction barriers were able to stop or decrease the wind's forces on the sediment or the bottom of Malheur Lake. And so with all that being said, wind reduction barriers could potentially improve the aquatic ecosystem during those low carp years, in which it's either we maintain the carp low or they just naturally fall low. So wind reduction barriers could be utilized to potentially promote that aquatic ecosystem recovery in the absence or diminishment of carp. So that got me thinking, now that I'm the Malheur National Wildlife Refuge biologist, what happened in the past? Because it wasn't man-made constructed barriers. So in years either when the carp were not around or the carp have gone down naturally, why did the ecosystem start to recover and now it doesn't? And this got me thinking, maybe it has to do with the emergent vegetation that is no longer present in Malheur Lake. started doing my research, and it turns out that emergent vegetation can be utilized similar, or emergent vegetation acts similar to wave reduction barriers. Emergent vegetation in research has been shown to dissipate wave action, decreasing sediment resuspension, decreasing nutrient suspension into the water column, and increasing the water clarity. So this is something that we were actually seeing on the ground, that there could be utilization of emergent vegetation if we can get it to expand back out into Malheur Lake as wind reduction barriers, natural wind reduction barriers. And so this brought us to our last point of what happened to the emergent vegetation? Why is it not out there, and why is it not coming back? Why does only the submergent vegetation come back quickly? And it turns out that the 1980 floods, in which Malheur Lake went from roughly 3 feet deep to 21 feet deep, totally decimated the emergent vegetation that used to be in Malheur Lake. And so looking through the historical records, I found out that Malheur Lake used to be covered by roughly 40 to 50% of emergent vegetation. So you could imagine that that emergent vegetation covering 40 to 50% of the lake area, in which now it covers roughly 1, 2, 3%, something along those lines, could have acted as wind reduction barriers, setting up the base for the pristine freshwater aquatic system of Malheur Lake. So if we get the emergent vegetation back, if we can control carp at the same time, we could potentially promote that clear water state that then would work towards that pristine state of Malheur Lake. Yeah, so as I was saying, I was lucky enough to be able to construct the model as the PhD student, but also now being the biologist out at Malheur National Wildlife Refuge, I'm able to actually go out there in the airboat as I'm collecting data and see how reality lines up with what we're seeing in the simulations. And one of those realities that wasn't quite matching up with the simulations was how the birds were utilizing the emergent vegetation as habitat, and how that emergent vegetation seemed to be diminishing the turbidity in the areas behind that emergent vegetation. So it started to become a realization to me that this emergent vegetation is so much more important to Malheur Lake than we've ever been giving it credit. We have always been talking about the carp and submergent vegetation, but this emergent vegetation is actually way more important than we're giving it credit for, not only as bird habitat, but also for this factor of acting as a wind reduction barrier, potentially clearing the water column so that the birds can utilize that, take advantage of that clear water column that would then promote submergent vegetation that they could use for eating macroinvertebrates that live within the submergent vegetation and eating the seeds that are produced by that submergent vegetation. So the reality of the situation being out there on the lake and not matching up to the simulation have helped us better understand what is actually the most important aspects of Malheur Lake and what might be missing. There's definitely a relationship between the birds, the aquatic vegetation, and the clear, pristine state of Malheur Lake. But you should probably try and find one of the field biologists from the birding tours, and so that they can let you know more about that relationship.